Good evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land where I'm located, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which you're joining us all, whether it's Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, or elsewhere around the world. I also extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here this evening. So welcome, I'm Tom Daley. I'm Deputy Director at the School of Government here at the University of Melbourne, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this joint lecture publicly hosted by the Melbourne Law School and Melbourne School of Government by Professor John Daley on Gridlock, Reforming Australia's Institutions to Unblock Policy Reform. And we're particularly pleased to host this important lecture and discussion today because it's International Day of Democracy, which provides a moment to reflect on how our democratic systems are performing. And for the School of Government, this is the first of a range of activities we'll be rolling out for the rest of the year under the title The Democracy Fix, which will also feature a range of experts from the law school and beyond. Now, before I formally introduce Professor Daley, I'll highlight two quick housekeeping matters. First, the chat function has been disabled, but you can submit questions using the Q&A function, and I'll be chairing the Q&A after the lecture. And second, the proceedings are being recorded and will be available on our website after the event. With that done, let me introduce the speaker. Professor Daley probably needs no introduction to most of you here. He's one of Australia's leading public policy thinkers and a professorial fellow at Melbourne Law School. He was the inaugural chief executive of the Grattan Institute for its first 11 years, where he published a range of leading reports on issues including institutional and tax reforms, government priorities, and budget policy. He's previously worked at the Department of Premier and Cabinet here in Victoria as a senior executive at ANZ Bank, and he's now a partner at EY Port Jackson Partners, and he's also chair of the Australian National Academy of Music. Now, his University of Melbourne roots run deep. He graduated from the law school in 1990 before going on to complete a DPhil in public law at the University of Oxford. And he tells us that his first real job was working as a research associate for Professor Cheryl Saunders. So tonight's talk is a return to his constitutional law roots, and it's based on his recent report, Gridlock, Removing the Barriers to Policy Reform, which has been hailed as a landmark analysis of how Australia's institutions affect the prospects of policy reform. So Professor Daley, we're delighted to have you present tonight's lecture, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that very, very warm introduction. Thank you, of course, to the University of Melbourne, both in its law school and the Melbourne School of Government, for the chance to talk to you this evening. As Tom pointed out, this is an institution that one way or another I've been entangled with for most of my life. I'd also like to acknowledge, in my case, probably both the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people. The house where I'm broadcasting from this evening is almost precisely on the borderline. And interestingly, it's also almost precisely on the borderline between the Macnamara and Higgins electorates, and almost precisely on the borderline between the city of Melbourne and the city of Stonington, which goes to show you just how long governance can tend to persist. And that's a theme of tonight's lecture, which is that institutions really matter and their effects tend to be extremely long-lasting. Obviously, I should also thank Grattan Institute, both for the chance to lead it for 11 and a half years. The work that I'll present tonight effectively uses, one way or another, pretty much all of that work over 11 and a half years. And of course, that was also the institution where I was able to write this piece, essentially looking back at what does the history of the last 11 years tell us about Australia's institutions and what do we need to do about them. And I'd also like to thank the Chris Cuff Family Foundation, who supported completion of this work. So in terms of what I was hoping to cover this evening, I guess three things. The first of those is to talk about where we are and is it really true that things have got worse? The second, to look back at what's happened. And then the third is to talk about, of course, what do we do about it? Now, I want to do this in the context of talking about institutional reform. And there are a number of ways that people think about institutional reform. So some people think that institutions matter and having good institutions matter because there's an intrinsic value to good government. They talk about the principles of accountability, of transparency, of access to government, of increasing both the reality and the perception that government is fair. And they think that all of those things are intrinsically worth doing and lead to a life more worth leading. The second reason you care about institutions is that you might believe that they reduce the risk of corruption. Some economists have done some work about this. It is very easy for soft corrosion of institutions to turn into corruption, and the costs of corruption, as a matter of empirical study, turn out to be extremely high. People wind up much less well off in societies when there's lots of corruption. But the rationale that I want to talk about this evening mostly is that if you have good institutions, it improves the chances of getting good policy on a whole range of areas, everything from health to education to energy and pretty much anything in between. So it's a slightly different kind of argument. It's an empirical argument about it. Well, if you want all of the things that good government delivers, then you need to have good government. And I think this is important when we're kind of talking to a law school audience, because as lawyers, we tend to focus on that first one, the intrinsic value of good government. We simply take it as axiomatic that government should be accountable and transparent and all the rest of it. And often there are a bunch of people in our society who don't necessarily get that. It's not sort of necessarily ingrained into their DNA in the same way that it kind of gets beaten into you at law school. Similarly, the argument about corruption appeals to some economists, but there's an awful lot of economists who, spend their life doing other things and are not particularly across that literature. Whereas this third argument, the one about good institutions increasing the chances of worthwhile substantive reform, is inherently an argument that can appeal both to economists and to social reformers and to lots of people who, perhaps mistakenly, but for whatever reason, don't care that much about those intrinsic drivers and the intrinsic value of good government that maybe to a lot of lawyers seems somewhat obvious. So that's the argument I want to make tonight, that good institutions are more likely to lead to good reforms. And of course, the converse, which is that if you have problems with your institutions, and as I'll be showing, I think Australia has many, you will wind up missing out on a lot of reforms. So, as I said, one of the three things I want to cover tonight is Australia getting worse at reform? What have been the enablers and blockers of reform over the last decade or so? And what might we do to our institutions that might improve our strike rate? So, looking at the first of those, is Australia getting worse? Well, one of the ways you can do this is just a simple piece of history. Look at what were all the things that happened under Hawke and Keating. And as you can see, it's a very long list. I'm not going to go through it all, but it's a long list. What happened under the Howard government? Again, it's quite a long list. When you dig into it, more of it happened in the first two terms of the Howard government than the last two terms. Then what happened under Rudd and Gillard? And then, of course, Rudd again. And then finally, what has happened under the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison governments. And fairly obviously, there's less of it. And indeed, when you look at it in a bit more detail, you see that many of the things that we have credited as reforms under the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison governments, frankly, are pretty small beer by the standards of the past. And we've also on this screen grayed out a number of the reforms that were either put in place or were formally announced by a government and which either were repealed by the successor or never happened. So, for example, the Abbott government announced that it would increase the age pension access age to 70, but never followed through. The Rudd-Gillard government implemented a demand-driven higher education system, but that was then repealed more recently. So the short answer is, just in this very crude way, it looks like less is happening. Now, one of the responses is, yes, but that's because there's less to do. As I'll be describing in the rest of this lecture, there is in fact a very large amount of stuff to do that has not happened. So I don't think that's much of an excuse. And there's also an argument, well, this is all because basically we had better leaders back in the past. And I guess I want to suggest that if you have better leadership at a point, for a significant period of time, and then for quite an extended period of time, you have much worse leadership, it might be telling you something about your institutions. And I think that's particularly so when you see that a lot more people would say that Hawke and Keating, not only was that a period of significant reform, but quite a lot of stuff happened under the state governments in that time, whereas less reform has happened under state governments over the last 20 years. We've also done an analysis that we describe in the report on which this lecture is based, the Gridlock report. We've done an analysis of OECD recommendations, and we've come to the same conclusion. So the short answer is, it looks like less reform is happening. So if we go on to the next question, which is, what are the enablers and blockers of reform, or what have they been? What we've done here is look at the whole series of reports that Grattan has released over the last 11 and a half years and ask what happened. Now, why have we done this? Well, the problem is that when you're doing institutional reform, there's a lot of methodological traps. The first of those traps is that there is a tendency for whoever is doing it to jump onto their favourite institutional hobby horse. If they think that the Senate is a problem, they will go and find a whole series of reforms in which the Senate was a problem. That doesn't prove that the Senate is a problem, that just proves that it's a hobby horse. And it also invites the response that whatever change you're talking about, reform you're talking about, didn't happen not because the institutions were weak, but because it was a silly idea in the first place. And actually the institutions were strong, and you can see that they're strong precisely because they ensured that your silly idea didn't happen. So what we've done is something slightly different. We've taken all of the major recommendations in Grattan reports between 2009 and 2019, which conveniently turns out to be the period essentially from the end of the global financial crisis to just before the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So in a funny way, it was a relatively normal period. We've taken each of those major recommendations, over 100 reports. Obviously, they overlap to some extent. And we've diagnosed whether the major recommendation happened, was it implemented? And we've also told the history, told the story about, well, what happened, if it did happen, what helped it to happen? If it didn't happen, what appeared to be the blocker? We've essentially analysed that and rationalised it into 73 reforms. We've looked at them like that, and then we've looked for the patterns. And the methodological advantages of doing that is it's a very large sample of reforms. It crosses a very broad portfolio, everything from health and education to energy and tax, and lots of other things as well, cities, transport, and so on. Those case studies and those reforms have by definition been selected in advance of any consideration about institutional issues. So by definition, we selected them at Grattan because they looked like important substantive areas of reform, rather than because we thought that they were going to tell us anything interesting about the institutions. By definition, every one of them already has an extensively argued case about why we at Grattan Institute, at least, thought it was a good idea. Now, you may not agree with us on every single one of them. In fact, I'd probably be a bit worried if you agreed with us on absolutely every single one of them. But I hope that you would agree that by and large, Grattan bats better than average. And that if a large number of things that Grattan is recommending are not happening, that tells us something about the institutions. And we've also got methodological advantage that I've relatively recently spelt out what were the values that were underlying all of that work in a publication called Prioritising a Government's Agenda. So that's what we've done from a methodological point of view. What did it tell us? So the short answer, we started with 73 reforms on the left. about 21 of them were adopted. And for all 21, they didn't face a major obstacle. And I'll talk in a moment about what we would count as a major obstacle. About 2 of them did get adopted despite there being a major obstacle. And then the rest didn't happen. So of the ones that didn't happen, and as you can see, that's about 2/3 of them didn't happen. What was the major reason they didn't happen? Well, about 15 of them were unpopular. And by unpopular, I mean that we've got pretty good evidence that if you did a poll of the population tomorrow, if you did a full-blown marriage survey on them tomorrow, most people would say that they thought it was a bad idea. Then there were about 10 that were what we call shibboleths. I'm going to spend a lot more time explaining what I mean by that in due course, but essentially these were things that ran counter to very deeply held ideology. There were about 6 that ran contrary to vested interests and where the evidence was very weak. As we will come to in due course, if there are vested interests but the evidence is actually pretty strong, the vested interests tend to matter rather less. There are about 3 where they were popular. There was no particular ideological issue. There were no particularly strong vested interests, but for whatever reason, the evidence, other than whatever Grattan had done, because obviously we didn't count Grattan as evidence, because by definition there was Grattan evidence for everything. There were about 3 where the evidence was really weak. There are about 5 where the budgetary cost was very large, $2 billion or more, and every single one where the budgetary cost was $2 billion or more per year didn't happen. And then there were about another 14 that for whatever reason were blocked, but didn't fit into any of those neat categories. And of course, there are any number of reasons why policy proposals don't happen, not least the fact that governments have just got a lot on and there's only so much they can do at once. So that's the overview. If we look in a bit more detail at why things didn't happen, and the first of those, as I said, was around unpopularity. So there's about 14 reforms where the public was strongly in favour, and as you can see, about half of them happened. A large number where the majority were in favour and quite a lot of them happened. A number where the public were indifferent. But here's the punchline. There were about 12 where on the evidence, they were opposed by a majority of the public, and not one of them happened. There were another 3 where the public strongly opposed, not one of them happened. Now, if you think back, this is a really big contrast to the Hawke, Keating and Howard eras. Many of the things that were implemented at that time were unpopular then, and actually quite a lot of them are still unpopular. So if you think about privatizations, there was a lot of that under Hawke, Keating and Howard. Most of those privatizations were unpopular then, and many of them still are. Many of the tax changes implemented by the Hawke and Keating governments were unpopular at the time. Capital gains tax in particular, and obviously the GST was unpopular at the time. Interestingly, popular opinion on those taxes has somewhat shifted, and they probably have popular support today, which may be another way of talking about the old adage in government, which is that an old tax is a good tax and a new tax is invariably an unpopular tax. So strikeout number 1 is that once upon a time, we used to do reforms at least some of the time when they were unpopular, and now we just don't. If a reform is going to be unpopular, it simply didn't progress. And there's lots of examples for this. So for example, the stamp duty to land tax swap, actually doing transport project cost benefit analysis, and then more to the point, actually basing decisions on it. Congestion pricing, lifting the age pension age, the age pension assets test so that it includes more of the value of the family home, ending the very large number of schemes we have to assist first home buyers to get into the market, or at least that's the theory, but in practice all they do is increase the prices that second home buyers get to sell for, rationalising the programs we have for regional development, increasing density so that we build more housing where people want it. All of these things, we can mount a very good argument as to why they're a good idea. They are all unpopular and not one of them has happened. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is this one that I described as shibboleths. So these are things where, as you can see, if there was no ideological issue, most things happened. If there are a few ideological reservations, actually the track record wasn't too bad. But if there was a full-on party shibboleth, it didn't happen. Now, what do I mean by shibboleth? Well, the word is actually originally a Hebrew word. It comes through to us in the Old Testament. There's a story in Judges. For those who have studied the Old Testament, most of it seems to consist of one tribe in the Middle East fighting with another tribe in the Middle East. This story in Judges is very much part of that tradition. One tribe had wound up on the wrong side of the river. The other tribe held the river crossing, and it was dark, and they didn't want to let the other tribe back across the river, and so they set a password. The password was shibboleth in Hebrew, which in Hebrew means an ear of corn. And the reason they set that as the password was that the tribe that was on the wrong side of the river had a different form of pronunciation, and so they pronounced it something like shibboleth. They couldn't pronounce th, and so the word has come down to us in English today to mean something that identifies you as a member of a tribe, a belief or a word, in this case, a belief that identifies you as a member of the tribe, but is often, there's no evidence for it, there's no particular rationale. Indeed, things are better shibboleths precisely when there's no evidence for them, because otherwise you might believe in it even though you're not a member of the tribe. The ideal shibboleth is one that you could only, you're much more likely to believe in it precisely because you're a member of the tribe rather than because it's actually true. As you can see, the track record of these things is not great. And the kind of things that we've classified into this category, the obvious one is climate change, which for at least the conservative wing of the coalition for the last 15 years or so, has identified you as a member of that coalition wing, a conservative wing. If you think that climate change really is a thing and is something where government ought to take really significant steps to actually do something about it, you basically get kicked out of that faction or you don't join it in the first place. Similarly, it's a belief amongst the entire Liberal Party that tax should be limited at the Commonwealth level to 23.9% of GDP. There is no particular rationale for selecting that particular number other than it happens to be more or less where the tax take was under the Howard government. It also manifests as an essentially almost invariable opposition to increasing tax rates. Now, not necessarily increasing tax take, because coalition governments use bracket creep all the time to increase the amount of tax you pay, and indeed the average tax rate that you in fact pay, but they don't formally change the tax rate. You will never find any member of the coalition publicly suggesting that IR protections need to be higher. These things are, cut both ways. The ALP has plenty of them too. So, for example, you will not find any member of the ALP, more or less since Paul Keating and his option C, suggesting that the GST or a value-added tax should be broadened or increased, even though it is perfectly possible to create a package that would either broaden or increase the GST that is in fact highly progressive. Similarly, you will not find any member of the ALP, sitting member of the ALP, that suggests that the superannuation guarantee shouldn't be increased to at least 12% and preferably 15%, even though there is lots of evidence that that policy change will in fact mostly hurt people in the bottom of the income distribution and mostly benefit people at the top. As I said, not one of these shibboleths has happened, with one exception, which is when the Turnbull government decided to effectively increase the rate of tax on superannuation for people who were retired and who were extremely wealthy. And it's worth remembering that when that happened, the Minister for Revenue, as she was known at the time, Kelly O'Dwyer, had her pre-selection threatened in retribution, even though most people who voted for the coalition actually thought it was a good change. Now, the views were rather different inside the Liberal Party, bearing in mind, of course, that party membership is much smaller than the number of people who vote for a party. So that's shibboleths. Another thing that turned out to be a big issue was around vested interests. I will admit, though, less of an issue than I expected when I started. And as you can see from this chart, where the vested interests were weaker, the track record is by and large, a lot of reforms happened if there was good evidence, but not much happened if there was weak evidence. The same thing happened when you have stronger vested interests. If there was really good evidence, if there was a report from the ACCC explaining why this thing was a really good idea, if there was a Productivity Commission report explaining why this reform was a really good idea, a lot of those reforms happened. If, on the other hand, the evidence was weak, by and large, the vested interests had their wicked way. So what explains this? I've talked about this with a number of public servants, and they say, look, this is roughly speaking what happens. We, the department, come into the minister and we say, we've got a really good idea, we should reform such and such. And the minister looks at us and says, well, we better talk to the people most affected. So the vested interest rocks up, and the vested interest invariably says, well, but minister, if you do this, the sky will fall in. When the minister turns to the public servants and says, so what evidence have you got that this is a really good idea? The public servants say, well, we've done this really good analysis and it shows such and such. And the vested interest says, yes, but, we're much closer on the ground and we can tell you all of the, collateral impacts of this. And if you do it, the sky will fall in. And the minister says to the public servants, well, what would you know? These people are much closer to the ground. So this is a dumb idea and we're not going to do it. If, on the other hand, the public servants say, but minister, this got investigated in detail by an independent body like the Productivity Commission or the ACCC, and they really investigated what was going to happen on the ground. And on page 28, or in the Productivity Commission's case, on page 258, it says that if you do this reform, the sky will not fall in. Then the minister tends to turn around to vested interest and say, look, you're just a vested interest. I don't believe you. I have a report here done by people who understood what was going on the ground, and it shows that if we do this reform, the sky will not fall in. And it shows just how powerful really good evidence turns out to be for reforms. Now, of course, that's a problem when governments have been often killing off independent bodies like the Productivity Commission, although that one at least survives over the last number of years, and where they've effectively commissioned less of this sort of thing, that does create problems in terms of getting reform through. And I guess one of the things that comes through the analysis we've done is to show just how much good evidence matters. As I said, I was not expecting to find this. As someone who used to run a think tank, I was really pleased to discover it. But it's nice to find out that evidence does indeed matter. And there's lots of examples of this. So, for example, if you're worried about power plants closing, then the smart thing to do is essentially to require the people who've got existing coal-fired power plants to put money into an escrow fund so that they don't shut it down before they say they're going to shut it down. In the electricity game, you want to stop people gaming the wholesale market. Pathology prices in Australia are way higher than they should be, given the increased volume and increased automation that we've got. The private health market has all kinds of prices that are way too high relative to the cost of the services, and yet nothing has happened. Why has nothing happened? And the answer is because, for one reason or another, government has never really assembled good independent evidence on these issues, and so the lobby groups tend to win. So it really matters. And indeed, when you do have evidence, often the lobby groups don't do so well. So to take just one of these examples very dear to my heart, when the Productivity Commission went through the superannuation issues very carefully, building on the work of things like the Cooper Review, showing just how much we were paying to have our superannuation managed and just how much things needed to change, not surprisingly, governments did respond to that. And that's one of the reforms that, by and large has happened. Still work in progress, but quite a lot of things have happened. So those are the kinds of things that get in the way. What kinds of things might improve the strike rate? Well, if we look at what's come through this analysis, there's a couple of things that we can identify as stylised facts. We're no longer doing unpopular reforms. Ideological positions are not being overcome by rational argument. There's an increasing tendency to repeal reforms, and the lobby groups do in fact often prevail, but not when the evidence base is strong. So why might this be happening? I think a number of things. Firstly, the professionalisation of politics. So politics today increasingly our politicians are people who've essentially come up through the ranks of being ministerial advisors. Our political parties have shrinking party membership. The most spectacular of those is the National Party in New South Wales, which has lost something like a third of its members over the last 5 years. We have growing patronage, so that essentially jobs go to people who are members of parties or former politicians or very closely allied with them. And we have a growing tendency for politicians to essentially go into the game of politics and then essentially get a job in some kind of lobbying role or working for a company where, you know, their politics knowledge is at the very least useful, rather than retiring to sort of do good works, which is, you know, what happened a lot more in the past. We have the growth of ministerial offices, and those ministerial offices are inherently risk averse. So they inherently don't like doing unpopular reforms because that's just going to cause trouble, and indeed, you know, potentially mean that ministerial advisors are less likely to get a job as an MP in due course. We have fewer semi-independent bodies. We've got a weaker public service. That public service does less evaluation. It publishes less. More policy work is being outsourced to consultants. And all of those things mean that the public service is less able to argue for things that might be unpopular, is less able to get the evidence put into the public domain that might counter lobby groups, is less able to unpick shibboleths that have grown up irrespective of the evidence. And we also have to acknowledge the role of the media. 24-hour media, social media, less expert media, more concentrated media, all of these things tend to make it harder to get up unpopular reforms, to get up things which counter people's beliefs, to get up things where the lobby groups are powerful, and to create space in which you can really go through the evidence. So what can we do about those things? Well, we can look at political funding limits and lobbying controls and restricting the revolving door and controlling more public appointments to everything from the AAT to the ABC board and, you know, many, many things in between, which would collectively have the impact of reducing somewhat the professionalisation of politics, growing patronage and so on. We can limit the size and background and immunity of ministerial offices, which would, again, reduce the professionalisation of politics, also reduce the influence of those ministerial offices, which I think would have the impact of making it that much more likely that ministers were prepared to do things that were unpopular, that much more likely to do things that run counter to some deeply held belief in their party, irrespective of the evidence. We could reform the public service to make it harder to try and make the appointments of senior public servants less dependent on whether you are seen as being one of us by the government in power. Although I'm not sure that that's such a big problem. I think much more of a problem is the way that it is now very easy to dismiss public servants. Something like a third of Commonwealth government secretaries have essentially been dismissed by government over the last 15 years. This is a bipartisan problem. And the most horrifying description of it is on record from Barnaby Joyce, who said that he was having problems getting sense out of his department. So he asked the secretary to come to his office and he fired him. And he said that from that point onwards, he got much better advice from the department. And they were much more, essentially saying that they were much more compliant. That is precisely the wrong reason for dismissing a senior public servant. The whole point is that we want a public service that is genuinely prepared to tell ministers, you know, on occasion what they don't want to hear. And we've essentially now got a situation in which ministers can dismiss secretaries essentially at will. There are no real constraints around it. I would suggest we also need to encourage more publication by the public service. It now barely ever happens. The Treasury, for example, used to publish about 12 articles a year in a thing called the Treasury Roundup, no longer exists. public service departments used to make independent submissions to parliamentary inquiries. You could tell they were independent because departments would actually disagree with each other in those submissions. We used to be a world in which Paul Keating could say on national television, when asked about something that had come out of Treasury that was contrary to his policy position, he said in that interview, "Yes, but that's Treasury's view, it's not my view." It is unthinkable that today a department would ever put anything into the public domain that was not the minister's view at the time. And of course, an independent commission against corruption, at least at the federal level, would have the effect that many of the federal rules around political funding and lobbying and the revolving door and so on actually got enforced rather than largely being ignored. So those are some of the remedies. Many of those things have been on the slate for a long time and have not happened, even though they are really popular. And even though they are not opposed by many lobby groups other than the political parties themselves. So for those who are essentially MPs and advisors, most of these reforms will be a really bad thing. And that's actually a trend that one can see around the world. These political parties have become much smaller membership, much more cartels, as they're described in the literature, in which essentially they benefit the people who are the members of parliament. In a sense, they exist for the members of parliament rather than being a way of mediating between the public and government. They've essentially become a core part of government itself. And they've got vested interests, by and large, in resisting any change to the system that they have become a very key part of. Interestingly, a lot of states and territories have implemented some of the reforms I've talked about, particularly around political funding and lobbying and independent commissions against corruption. The Commonwealth, on the other hand, has done almost none of these things apart from setting up a parliamentary budget office. And I think when you look at the history of the states, a lot of the time it's happened because there were major inquiries, such as the Fitzgerald Royal Commission in Queensland or ICAC hearings in New South Wales, that created a rolling public theatre that was on the news every night that meant that something actually happened. And I think there's also a bit of copycat federalism going on in which one state does it, the sky doesn't fall in, and then it becomes very difficult to resist doing it in another state. But there's been no progress anywhere on public service independence or the role of ministerial advisors or the role of the revolving door. And as I said, our major political parties have a vested interest in resisting that. But, and it's a big but, minor parties have much less of an interest in resisting that. By and large, their MPs know they're never going to become ministers. They're not part of some large party machine. And often they get elected on some kind of platform about cleaning up politics. And so it's a natural part of their platform. And it's no coincidence that by and large, our minor parties at the federal level have been big supporters of institutional reform, such as lobbying reform, donations reform, and a federal commission against corruption. And it's worth remembering that often these things, where they have happened because the minor party held the balance of power and it extracted this kind of institutional reform as the price of supporting one of the major parties into government. If you look at the trend in the minor party vote at the Commonwealth level, which over the medium run is essentially up, the chances of the minor parties holding the balance of power in the lower house, where of course they get to choose, essentially select government, are increasingly high. When you remember, the current federal parliament has essentially 6 minor party and independent members of the lower house. In a parliament of 150, 6 people are sooner or later going to hold the balance of power, simply as a matter of sort of statistics. So I think that this is a real opportunity. But of course, in order to be effective in doing that, the minor parties need to have their ammunition ready. And it's worth remembering that one of the reasons we wound up with a Commonwealth Parliamentary Budget Office is that it was part of the price of power imposed by the independents when Gillard ran a minority government. There's a second thing that I would point to. which is, I guess, very much comes from my heritage as a Melbourne University law graduate. I do remember Cheryl Saunders lecturing us in my constitutional law classes about the way you cannot understand constitutional law without understanding conventions, and that conventions are often a really good idea. They're often a first best way of organising things because they're flexible, they allow for exceptions, they focus attention on the underlying principles, and in a sense, they're inevitable. You know, we're never going to succeed in writing down everything about how government works. But I would suggest to you, conventions are losing their effectiveness. They're increasingly ignored. Many politicians have the perception that they can break them and the electorate will not punish them for doing so. They perceive at least a short-term electoral advantage in ignoring them. There's an increasing perception, perhaps because of the professionalisation of politics, that electoral victory matters a lot more than the system. And there's a perception, I think increasingly, that the process doesn't actually improve outcomes. So this is a problem when, you know, conventions about appointments and FOI and ministerial accountability and pork barrelling are part of the weaker institutions that explain why substantive reforms are not happening. And I want to suggest to you that however good conventions are, if they are indeed complied with, they are no use to us if they're not being complied with. And it may well be better to legislate them into law if they're not being complied with. And if you take, for example, one convention that we've legislated into law, indeed into the Constitution, around the filling of casual Senate vacancies, I think the experience of the last, 43 years would suggest actually legislating that convention has worked pretty well. And it is true that legally enforceable rules may be second best to a convention that is adhered to, but I want to suggest that they're probably much better than ineffective conventions that are being routinely ignored. Now, if you look at the long list of reforms that I've been talking about that I think will, one way or another, increase the chances of good reform happening, a lot of them we can sketch out, and maybe other people have sketched out, but frankly, they've only been sketched out. And if many of these things are only going to happen when independents push for them, they probably need a bit more help than that, because by and large, independents don't have the resources of government, and they often don't have very long in between that magic point where they realise they've got the balance of power and when they need to get things to happen, because governments have a track record of reneging on these things. So, for example, controls over appointment and dismissal of secretaries outlined by, recommended by the Thodey thing on the public service, but not detailed. Similarly, around controls and limits on ministerial advisors. In terms of patronage, we've often got very little written down about, you know, what might be a good way of running the system. On vested interests and reform donations and lobbying, actually that's been pretty well defined by the states. We do need to adapt that for the Commonwealth, but that's a bit easier. Setting up a Commonwealth Independent Corruption Commission is something where a lot of lawyers have done a lot of work, and I think we now know actually pretty accurately how that would or should work, although I suspect would look nothing like the bill that the current Conservative government has suggested. And so on. If you look at that list, there is a lot of work for the Melbourne Law School to do. These things are only going to happen if these reforms have been thought through carefully, the pros and cons, the corners have been thought through, and there's kind of draft legislation ready to go if and when a minor party wins balance of power. So that's all I wanted to present, and I'll now be delighted to take as many questions as we can fit in.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting presentation, and having read the report, it was great to see it come to life and for you to draw out those sort of really key areas. So I will also join you with a strong encouragement for those with us to submit their questions. You can just use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I think while we're waiting for a Q&A to come in, and we have just sort of about 15 minutes left, I think, before we're wrapping up. I might just ask, where does COVID come into this picture? Because I know you deal with it in the report. How much do you see COVID as having been a massive opportunity cost in the sense of sucking time away and opportunities away from dealing with some of this and achieving some reforms? And on the flip side, do you see it also as potentially having fed a greater sort of propensity to achieve some reform, to change things up?
I mean, this is something we kind of looked at in the recovery book that Grattan published in about June last year. So just as I was finishing as chief executive, trying to think about what are the priorities for government in a kind of COVID world. So a couple of observations I'd make. The first is governments had plenty of time between 2009 to 2019 to do a lot of the things we're talking about. And I would, hasten to add, pretty much all of the reforms that Grattan recommended were not new ideas. I mean, most of these were things that have been kicking around for quite some time. And from a methodological point of view, we just point to them as, here's a group of reforms that we think are pretty good ideas. Government could have picked them up indeed before 2009. And it certainly, they didn't hit anyone's desk by and large as a sort of, radical new eureka moment when Grattan wrote its report. So we've had a 10-year period in which, as I've said, an awful lot of reform didn't happen. Much less happened than, in the past. And the obstacles I've talked about appear to be very significant. In terms of COVID, and I guess this was the point of the recovery book, to be blunt, COVID is pretty tough. And it has created an enormous amount of work for government to do, in which the urgent, for once, really is important. And governments simply, governments have limited bandwidth. By and large, they have not had bandwidth to do anything that they didn't really have to do with COVID. Now, that said, some things have happened that should have happened a really long time ago, but because they were urgent for COVID, we're now probably going to get to keep them. So, for example, telehealth should have happened a very long time ago. It's now happened because governments had no choice, and hopefully we will now get to keep it. And COVID, of course, has also demonstrated that if governments really put their minds to things, they can do a lot, and occasionally things that they think are going to be wildly unpopular once they put them in place turn out to be wildly popular. So most governments thought that the sort of restrictions we're living with under COVID would be incredibly unpopular. And of course, as the WA government has found out, actually the reverse is probably true. So, it turns out that doing the right thing actually does tend to get you, re-elected. But I think governments have, to some extent, a little bit lost sight of that over the last 10 years.
It's a lesson well worth keeping in mind, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing I would say is, does COVID create opportunities? I'd love to believe it, but I think in the short run, governments are just going to continue to be focused on COVID, and most of the things we've talked about as reforms, don't really fit that mold. And in the long run, I see no reason that COVID's going to lead to any significant shift in the kind of underlying institutional forces I've spoken about. And I suspect once we're in a with COVID world, but stable, it's going to look much like I've described. And the only way it's going to change is if we change our institutions. Mm-hmm.
So this brings us back to, I see questions are coming in now from our participants. And the first question asks, and this very much is in line with your theme, what about electoral cycles? Should they be longer?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it turns out the state governments have, in fact, where the electoral cycles, of course, tend to be 4 years rather than 3, and of course, fixed terms as opposed to flexible terms, probably have done a bit more than the Commonwealth government in terms of reform over the last 10 years. But on the other hand, they're by and large responsible for different areas where public opinion tends to be rather less of an issue. And so it's in a sense been easier for them to get reform to happen. So it's hard to know from our analysis whether short terms make a difference. I mean, one of the things one can observe is an awful lot happened under Hawke and Keating, and they had the same rules that we have today. So I'm not sure that makes a difference. And also that the reality is there are very, very few one-term 3-year governments in Australia. Almost invariably, if the electorate gives you one go, they'll give you a second one. So, a newly elected government can pretty much count on 6 years as a matter of reality. And so I'm far from convinced that 3-year terms are the major problem here. I think there's all kinds of reasons why fixed terms are a good idea. Apart from anything else, I think they lead to much better planning. And, I don't think there's any public interest, frankly, in having variable terms. So I think that'd be a good reform. But for all of the reasons that we know and love dearly, I suspect that the Commonwealth government, any Commonwealth government, would be very reluctant to bring it in.
Thank you so much. Our second questioner sort of brings up the question of where are reforms likely to come from. So he's picking up on John Quiggin's recent monthly article about the decline in federal government capacity for sort of policy or program delivery, and asks, is future reform likely to come more from state governments, and how might national cabinet contribute? Yeah,
I will confess I'm a deep skeptic. As somebody who worked with Cheryl Saunders on COAG 30 years ago, I kind of feel I've seen this movie before. Every couple of years we rejig our federal state relations and we declare a brave new world. And then after a little while, we discover it's kind of, in fact, just the same. What's been different over the last 2 years is that we've had a series of issues in which the Commonwealth government genuinely had no power, and its power of the purse didn't help. And so very unusually for Australia's political and policy history for the last 20 years, in effect, the federal government was dealt out of the game. What rules various states imposed in terms of their health orders, the Commonwealth could lecture them from the sidelines, but it became pretty obvious very quickly that states were just going to make their decisions irrespective of what the Commonwealth thought. And many would say, myself included, in retrospect, a good thing too. I think that's probably reminded states that they have real power and that they're actually not so hopeless at policy when they put their mind to it. And some of the kind of Commonwealth state dynamic, I think, has been a little bit about learned helplessness from the states. And I think they've kind of learned power in the last year and a half, and I think they'll remember that. So I think we probably will see more coming from the states rather than them, for example, waiting for the Commonwealth government to kind of give them some massive incentive to do congestion pricing. They might just get on and do it. So I think that dynamic will be different. But I think overall, the big dynamics are not going to change until we change our institutions. That's the core point of this report. It is the institutions that are getting in the way. The institutions have without doubt got worse over the last 15 years. And until we change them, we shouldn't expect them to deliver any better.
Okay, and this is really interesting because it brings in that sort of relationship between the leaders and how they behave, and then the sort of authorizing or shaping environment of the institutions themselves. And we have an interesting question here of, to what extent are conventions, which you sort of highlighted, how to what extent are they known and understood, and could more education help if they're sort of losing their effectiveness?
Look, I'd love to believe that more education of the public would help, but I think the public knows that pork barrelling is bad. Indeed, we know, and we've got survey evidence that you ask people about pork barrelling, and unless they happen to be the electorate that's benefiting, they think it's a really bad idea. But nevertheless, politicians are increasingly doing it. We don't need to educate the public that ministers should resign when they kind of really stuff up. But they've discovered that there is no penalty to basically just toughing out the fight. Unless the electorate is prepared to vote, governments out for failing to adhere to conventions, and it doesn't look like they do. And more to the point, I think this is the real problem. Politicians have now figured that out. They've figured out that it doesn't really cost them anything if they breach them. And so I don't think any amount of public education is going to change it. The only thing that does change it is when you have this kind of nightly news cycle, essentially saying this government is a corrupt government or has the following major problems, that cuts through. But until it gets to that level where it's kind of on the nightly news every single night, and it's only kind of really Royal Commissions or ICAC hearings that have that kind of dynamic, it just doesn't cut through.
So that's really interesting as well. I mean, I see a lot of questions coming up here, but one of them that sort of comes out as well from the dimension of COVID earlier is a question: has COVID increased our evidence-based decision-making, and what should we learn? I mean, that really speaks to the idea of the kinds of constraints that you would like to sort of have for good governance or good policy making. What do you think?
Look, there's no question that COVID has increased the status of expert work, obviously on the health front, but interestingly, really, even on the economic front. I mean, ironically, it was only a month or two after Scott Morrison had delivered a speech to essentially, in Canberra, to essentially the assembled public service saying, you know, the job of my ministers is to set policy and your job is basically to implement it. I didn't quite say that. I mean, I think that's a caricature of what he said, but it was pretty easy to read the speech that way. Within about 2 months, he was saying, oh, well, we are only doing this, you know, JobKeeper or whatever the latest thing was because of Treasury's advice, you know, and it was a long time since government had said anything that they were doing because of Treasury's advice. So there's no question that governments have spent a year and a half elevating the status of expert opinion. And I think that that will inevitably persist to some extent. But you know, we will see how much.
We will. I think we're getting towards the end of our time, but we might have time to squeeze in just one more sort of question. I'll try to pull two together. One asks about, you know, this diminishing sort of influence of the public service in the policymaking process. Has that increased the relative influence of reports by private economic consultants? And another question asks, where's industrial policy in all of this? And is the lack of focus on industrial policy leaving a lot of things off the agenda, like gender equality and so on? So what do you think of that?
Yeah, look, I think to take that first point around industrial relations, look, I think there's all sorts of reasons why industrial relations has stayed off the agenda, not least that it does run across this very big shibboleth in the Liberal Party. It's a kind of defining thing that, you know, they believe in, just in general, less industrial relations legislation and control, even when it's a really good idea. And so I think that has not helped in that area. But I think we should admit, you know, industrial relations is not, you know, the be all and end all of policy. And actually, when you look at the real differences between the parties on industrial relations, precisely because the Hawke and Keating government effectively kicked off such a big deregulation of the system, the differences between the parties are not that large. So, you know, when you look at the Grattan and, for that matter, the OECD agenda, you know, industrial relations is a relatively small part of that. In terms of economic consultants, and of course I am one, although I should stress that of course all of the views this evening are my own and should not be attributed to EY or Port Jackson Partners. There's no question that there are issues around that increasingly policy work is being outsourced to private sector consultants. Inherently, they are probably more subject to pressure than public servants because, you know, inherently they're worrying about where the next job is coming from. I would say that the best work is done precisely by consultants who are prepared to say no to the minister. And in the long run, that might well lead to them not only giving better advice, but getting more work. Because in the long run, giving good advice really matters. But you can understand why plenty of consultants don't take such a long run view and are very suspect to, you know, worrying about whatever it is that the minister wants to hear. So I don't think that is helping in terms of creating evidence that really will serve the public interest, as opposed to telling the minister what the minister wants to hear. And, you know, unfortunately, good policy is sometimes something the minister does want to hear the first time. Now, my Grattan experience has been on many of the things that did happen. Invariably, the minister thought they were a dumb idea the first time. And the second time, they thought they were a bit interesting. And the third time, they said, oh, look, yeah, like we've always been planning to do that. Like, you're wasting my time. Yeah, it's happening.
Well, that's a great sentence to end on. We can say change is always possible. And you've given us a lot to think about in terms of what are the main problems and what are some of the solutions. So just on behalf of Melbourne Law School and the Melbourne School of Government, I just want to thank you so much for this really illuminating public lecture. And thank you so much to all of you who joined us for it. So I'll say good evening to all of you.
Thank you.